Well, America's accountant, Dan Geltrude, joins me now to answer that. Dan, thanks for being with us. It's great to have you. What do you make of this lazy girl job trend? I mean, I understand the whole goal is to avoid anxiety, but talk to us about some of the negative impacts this mindset is having and why this isn't necessarily easing anxiety.
At some point in time, Allison, we all have to be grown-ups. Now, we can put it off for a period of time, but at some point in our lives, we have to say, hey, I actually have to be a responsible adult. And it seems to me that this whole trend is about putting that off. Now, I get that maybe if you're in high school, but I mean, come on. Over time, you have to be a productive part of society, and people have to look at what they do and find meaning. Just, trying to get around the system and beat the system isn't the way to do things. Now, look, I believe part of the reason that this is happening is because employers for quite some time now have been absolutely desperate to find people to quote unquote work, even if they're only working at a minimum capacity. But what we are seeing now is how outsourcing, let's say, to other countries and using artificial intelligence to either fill in for American workers, or in this case, it may be to replace non-productive workers. So I think at some point the sand runs out of the hourglass, and those that are participating in this lazy girl trend are going to have to wake up to reality.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I think it's such a juvenile perspective to have, and to think that you can live your whole life that way is just completely unrealistic. And I think what's happened, honestly, to Gen Z is a national travesty, really. I mean, this generation is definitely the most troubled in America's history, I think, primarily due to the addictive consumption of social media content, causing them really irreparable damage. Do you believe this is the result of Gen X parents bending over backwards to give their kids everything and more while growing up, providing them with all they maybe didn't have when they were children, and therefore resulting in Gen Z and even some millennials being raised with little adversity and character building experiences?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a contributing factor. How much? I don't know. But, this goes into the thought process of every generation wants to see the next generation have a better life. I mean, I look at that for me personally, and my parents and grandparents had it much more difficult than I did. And now I want to have my children have a better life and even an easier life. But that doesn't mean a lazy life. So I think there's a fine line here of providing discipline and guidance, and between that and just letting them have a life without, meaning. And that's, to me, what this comes down to. What do you want your life to mean? At some point in time when you're at the end, at a ripe old age, do you want to look back and say, boy, I really got around the system? Or would you rather say, I really worked hard and accomplished some things?
Yeah. Well, I think we know what the right answer is there. And you know the old saying, hard times create strong men and so forth. So I think we're seeing that cycle continue on here. But since we're talking about being lazy, Dan, did you know people are now hiring celebrities to do their dirty work for them? Yes, now people are paying actors on the app Cameo to deliver touchy messages. For example, their place of work, so they don't have to let their job know they're quitting, or to their significant other to let them know they're being dumped. Dan, what do you make of this? Is this really an acceptable way to break the news to a job or a boyfriend?
Well, I have to say, it is kind of funny. I don't know about being on the receiving end of having some celebrity tell me that someone is breaking up with me or divorcing me or quitting their job. I mean, that would probably be less funny. But the concept, I mean, think about that, of having a celebrity step in, that you pay, by the way, perhaps from a lazy girl job, to do your dirty work. I mean, I, I just think back at all the things that I knew growing up compared to what's happening in the world now. And it's just inconceivable. I could not think of a world where, again, in high school, where a girl would break up with me and use a celebrity to do that.
It
I
really
I think
is.
I,
I think it's just insane, right? And I think it just goes to show how we are, not holding ourselves accountable to do the difficult things, right? Like no one wants to tell their job they're quitting and no one wants to break up with their significant other, but you have to just do it, right? And that's part of what is wrong with society today is they don't want to do anything that requires any hard work. So I think it's sad, but I don't even know if we can turn things around at this point. It seems like we're too far gone. Switching gears here, Dan, a new report from myelisting.com found that the state of California lost nearly $350 million in tax revenues in 2021 due to migration out of the state, which is crazy. Dan, talk to us about how these staggering trends affect the state's economy and impacts job creation.
Sure. And no one really should be surprised about this. And the irony here is that it's really a vicious cycle. So if you take these high taxing states, whether it's California, which is number one for migration, and I believe New York is number two, the taxes, the state taxes, and even the cost of living overall is so high that you have people leaving. And then what happens? The government in these states are spending so much money and they have to keep feeding that monster. So what happens is the people that stay end up being punished with what? More taxes, because you have to meet that minimum amount of what the government is spending. And even if the government goes out and borrows, you still have to meet those debt payments. So these states that think that they could just tax their way out of every problem are going to be sadly mistaken as their population dwindles. Therefore, their tax-paying base goes down. And what you're left with, again, the people that stay pay more, and then they get to the point where they're going to leave. So, turn the lights out if you're the last one left.
Yeah, amen to that. It's pretty crazy to see it happening. I guess it means, though, there won't be any lazy girls here in California because there's no way they can afford to live here. But anyway, I think it's just no surprise as to why people are fleeing the once golden state. The myriad of tyrannical Marxist policies implemented by dictator Gruesome are enough to drive even liberals out. But speaking of driving, Ford Motor Company just revealed that a $4.5 billion loss has been projected for its line of electric vehicles, which is almost twice as much as its $2.1 billion loss on its Model E division back in 2022. Dan, why are we seeing such huge losses on EVs, especially when people like dictator Newsom and several other governors have announced their states are switching over to 100% electric by the year 2035?
I think that just goes to show that those goals that these states are outlining are just not realistic. So what happens when you want to make every car company or force every car company to produce electric vehicles? It is expensive to do that. And that's why, you're seeing Ford, although their revenues are up, are having substantial losses related to their EV division. So now over time, what ends up happening here? Because the costs are so high, those costs are going to end up being passed on to the consumers who now have to buy EVs because the laws in these various states are changing. So what are you supposed to do? Go out of state to buy a car, a regular car, and then come back to your state with that, or you end up having to spend all kinds of money to buy an EV to be in compliance. So this is just more government interference and not really understanding how economies work. Prime example.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that people don't want to switch over to EVs, so hopefully we can push back on that, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how it all shapes up. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.